The medieval world was not the simple place that history tends to describe. It was not merely a long grey corridor between the fall of Rome and the Renaissance, populated by superstitious peasants and brutal kings waiting for the modern world to arrive and explain everything. It was a world of extraordinary complexity, of deep learning and profound belief, of institutions that lasted centuries and secrets that were buried so thoroughly that we have spent 500 years trying to excavate them. And there are things we still have not found. There are questions that were asked in the medieval world and have not been answered. There are events that were recorded and still do not make sense. There are people who disappeared, documents that were sealed, places that were abandoned, deaths that were announced but never fully explained, and treasures that were hidden so well that they have not been found in the 7 or 8 centuries since the hiding. Tonight we are going to sit with all of it, slowly, in the dark, in the way that the medieval world itself understood darkness. Before we begin, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you enjoy these late night wanderings, and comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's begin. We start with the most famous manuscript that no one has ever been able to read, a book that has been sitting in libraries and archives for 600 years, written in a language that may not exist, about subjects that may be entirely imaginary, by a hand that has never been identified. Chapter 1. The book that no one can read. The Voynich manuscript is 240 pages of vellum, handwritten in an unknown script, illustrated with strange and intricate drawings, and it has been studied continuously by cryptographers, linguists, scholars, and obsessives for more than a century. No one has been able to read it. Not entirely, not convincingly, not in a way that other scholars have accepted. The manuscript takes its name from Wilfrid Voynich, a Polish book dealer who purchased it in 1912 from a Jesuit college in Frascati, Italy, along with a collection of other old manuscripts. When Voynich examined what he had bought, he recognized immediately that one of the books was unlike anything he had seen before. The text was written in a script that matched no known alphabet. The language behind the script, if it was a language, matched no known tongue. The illustrations were elaborate and utterly strange. Carbon dating has placed the vellum, the treated animal skin on which it was written, in the early 15th century, somewhere between 1404 and 1438. This gives us a date of manufacture, but not a date of composition. The text may have been copied from an earlier source. The original may be older still. The illustrations are organized into rough thematic sections, and they are deeply unsettling if you study them long enough. The botanical section contains drawings of plants, hundreds of them, roots and stems and leaves and flowers, rendered in careful detail, in the kind of systematic way that medieval herbals were organized, except that the plants do not match any known species. Some of them bear a passing resemblance to real plants, a root that might be a mandrake, a flower that might be a daisy, if you squint and are generous. But none of them is definitively identifiable. They may be fantastical plants, entirely imagined. They may be highly stylized real plants, rendered in a convention we have lost the key to. They may be real plants from a specific regional tradition that has not survived. No botanist who has examined them has been able to say, with confidence, this is a real plant that I recognize. The astronomical section contains circular diagrams, zodiac-like wheels with figures around the edges, star maps, or celestial charts of some kind. The figures in the zodiac wheels are naked female figures, small and rounded, arranged around the outside of the circles, like the figures in medieval illuminated calendars, except that the signs they are associated with do not consistently match the standard medieval zodiac. The biological section is the most unsettling of all. It contains drawings of naked female figures bathing in interconnected pools and tubes, the tubes running from one figure to another and looping through the pools in elaborate organic patterns. The figures are not sexualized, they are not idealized, they are simply there, in their pools, connected by the tubes, bathing in some substance or liquid that may be water or may be something else entirely. Some of the figures seem to be emerging from flowers, some appear to be inside the tubes themselves. The overall impression is of a biological or cosmological diagram of some kind, but what system it is diagramming is entirely unclear. There is a pharmaceutical or recipe section containing small drawings of containers and jars alongside fragments of text that may be recipes or preparations of some kind. And then there is the densely written text that runs through all of it. The Voynich script has been analyzed exhaustively. It has statistical properties consistent with a natural language. Certain character combinations appear with the frequency patterns that real languages display. Rare characters occur in the positions where rare characters typically occur in human speech. The text has a rhythm and a structure that seems to encode meaning. It is not gibberish in the simple sense. Whatever it is, it has internal consistency. It is not encrypted Latin. It is not encrypted Arabic. It is not any known European, Middle Eastern, or Asian language in any known cipher. Every major code-breaking technique that has been applied to it has either produced nothing coherent or produced results so speculative that they have not been accepted. The theories about what the Voynich manuscript is have filled books. It is a constructed language invented by its author, comprehensible only to those who knew the key, which has been lost. It is a deliberate hoax designed from the beginning to appear meaningful while encoding nothing, a supremely sophisticated piece of nonsense constructed by someone who understood enough about language statistics to fake them for purposes that were never recorded. It is a real language of a small and obscure community that was wiped out before their linguistic tradition could be transmitted. It is a pharmacological or alchemical text written in a private cipher by a practitioner who did not want their knowledge shared. It is something else entirely, something we have not yet thought of. The manuscript is currently held at the Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University. It has been digitized in high resolution and is freely available online. Anyone can look at every page, and on every page, the neat, consistent, utterly opaque script runs on and on, saying something to no one who has yet learned to listen. The Voynich manuscript is the most famous unread text of the medieval period, but it is far from the only one. Across the medieval world, there are texts whose contents we know, whose languages we can read, but whose meaning defies explanation in a different and in some ways more disturbing way, because we can understand every word, and the words describe things that should not have happened. Chapter 2. The Dancing Plague. In July of 1518, in the city of Strasbourg, then part of the Holy Roman Empire, now in northeastern France, a woman named Frau Trophäa stepped into the street and began to dance. She had not been asked to dance. There was no music. There was no festival. It was an ordinary day in an ordinary street, and Frau Trophäa began to dance, and she could not stop. She danced for days. Her feet bled. Her body exhausted itself. She fell and rose and fell again. She could not stop. Within a week, 34 people had joined her. Within a month, the number had reached 400. They danced in the streets of Strasbourg day and night, without music, without rest, unable to stop. People were dying. The physicians who were called in examined the dancers and pronounced, with the particular confidence of those who do not understand what they are seeing, that the cure was more dancing. The city authorities, accepting this recommendation, cleared the guild hall and hired professional musicians to play for the dancers. They erected a wooden stage. They apparently believed that if the dancers could dance themselves to exhaustion, in an organized and supervised way, the affliction would pass. It did not pass. People continued to die of heart attacks, of strokes, of sheer physical exhaustion. The dancing continued for weeks. Some accounts say it lasted into September, nearly 2 months after Frau Trophäa first stepped into that street. And then, gradually, it stopped. The dancers recovered or died, and the ones who recovered did not dance again, at least not in this way, and the city of Strasbourg returned to its ordinary life, and the summer of 1518 became a story. The dancing plague of 1518 is the most famous of what historians call episodes of mass psychogenic illness, collective psychological events in which physical symptoms spread from person to person through a community under severe stress. And the summer of 1518 in Strasbourg was a summer F extreme stress. There had been famine. There had been disease. The population was living under the kind of sustained material and spiritual pressure that, in some individuals and in some communities, under some conditions, produces physical symptoms that cannot be controlled. The most widely accepted modern explanation is that the dancing spread as a form of stress release through social transmission, that Frau Trophäa's initial episode was a genuine psychological break, and that seeing her, other people in similarly desperate circumstances found their own suppressed distress expressing itself in the same form. This explanation is plausible. It is probably, in broad outline, correct. But it does not answer every question. It does not explain why the dancing specifically, and not some other physical expression. It does not explain why, of the perhaps 15,000 people living in Strasbourg that summer, 400 danced, and the rest did not. It does not explain the precise mechanism by which watching someone dance compelled others to dance against their will in a form they could not control and could not stop. The 1518 plague was not the first such event in the region. There had been dancing plagues in the Rhine Valley in the 14th century, at Erfurt in 1237, where a group of children danced themselves to exhaustion along the Rhine in 1374, where thousands of people danced through multiple cities for weeks. Something about this particular region, this particular period, this particular kind of collective human experience produced this kind of collective human response. Frau Trophäa's name is the only one we know from the 1518 plague. We do not know if she survived. We do not know what she remembered afterward of the days she spent dancing in the street. We do not know what it felt like from the inside to be dancing and to know you were dancing and to be unable to stop. The streets of Strasbourg are quiet tonight. The half-timbered buildings stand as they have stood for centuries. Nothing dances. But in July of 1518, in those same streets, something moved through 400 people that none of them could name and none of them could resist. From the strange convulsions of the living, we move to a death that has never been adequately explained, a death that took place not in a Strasbourg street, but in a locked room in a castle, and that changed the course of English history before anyone understood what had actually happened. Chapter 3. The Princes in the Tower. In the summer of 1483, 2 boys disappeared from the Tower of London. They were Edward, aged 12, and Richard, aged 9, the sons of the recently deceased King Edward IV of England. Edward was the heir to the English throne. Richard IV in waiting. They had been placed in the Tower, which in that period served as a royal residence as well as a fortress and prison, in preparation for Edward's coronation. The coronation never happened. Their uncle, Richard Duke of Gloucester, moved with remarkable speed in the weeks after Edward IV's death. He had himself declared protector of the realm. He had Edward IV's marriage declared invalid on grounds that have never been fully explained, making both boys illegitimate and removing them from the line of succession. He had himself crowned King Richard III, and the 2 boys, in the tower were seen less and less frequently through the summer months, and then not at all. They were never seen again. What happened to them? This is one of the most debated questions in English history, and it has been debated continuously for 540 years without resolution. The most widely held traditional view is that Richard III had the boys murdered. He had the clearest motive. Their existence was a permanent threat to his claim to the throne, and as long as they lived, there would always be those who considered them the rightful kings. The timing of their disappearance is consistent with this view. And when Henry VII defeated Richard III at Bosworth Field in 1485 and took the throne as the first Tudor king, he never produced the princes or explained what had become of them, which raises its own questions. But the case against Richard III is entirely circumstantial. No contemporary source explicitly states that he ordered their deaths. No body was ever produced, no confession, no witness account, no document, only the absence, the two boys, and then nothing. In 1674, workmen renovating the Tower of London discovered a wooden box under a staircase containing the bones of two children. King Charles II, accepting the identification, had the bones interred in Westminster Abbey under a white marble urn inscribed with the names of the princes. Whether those bones actually belonged to the princes has never been confirmed. An examination in 1933 produced inconclusive results. The Church of England has not permitted DNA analysis, though requests have been made. The bones remain in their urn. If they are the princes, they have been in Westminster Abbey for nearly 350 years, officially identified, officially mourned. If they are not the princes, then somewhere, in the Tower or elsewhere, the remains of Edward V and Richard Duke of York have been lying for 5.5 centuries, unidentified, unremarked, waiting. And the question of who gave the order, if anyone did, in the way the traditional story requires, remains exactly as open as it was in 1483, when two boys walked through the tower's gates and did not walk out again. The Tower of London has a long history of housing royal prisoners who are never seen again. Jawohl, but the mystery of the princes is the most complete of all its silences, because in every other case, every other execution, every other death within those walls, there is at least a record, a date, a name, a note in someone's account book. For the princes there is only the absence, which in its way is louder than any record. From the locked rooms of the tower, we move to a locked room of a different kind. The sealed archives of an institution that spent 700 years accumulating secrets before anyone outside it was allowed to see them. Chapter 4. The Templars and What They Knew. On the morning of Friday, October 13th, 1307, agents of King Philip IV of France arrested every Knight Templar in France simultaneously. The operation was coordinated across the entire country. Thousands of men arrested on the same day, at the same hour, at locations separated by hundreds of miles. The planning required for such an operation, the secrecy, the coordination, the logistics, was extraordinary. The charges were sensational. The Knights Templar, the military religious order founded in Jerusalem in 1119, originally charged with protecting Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land, grown over nearly 2 centuries into one of the most powerful and wealthy institutions in Europe, were accused of heresy, of denying Christ during their initiation ceremonies, of spitting on the cross, of worshipping an idol called Baphomet, of obscene rituals, of sodomy, of corruption and apostasy of every kind. The trials lasted 7 years. Confessions were obtained, under torture, in most cases, though the records are careful not to say so directly. Some Templars confessed, and then recanted, and then confessed again. The Grand Master of the order, Jacques de Molay, confessed under torture, recanted publicly, and was burned at the stake in 1314. According to legend, as the flames took hold, he cursed King Philip and Pope Clement V, both of whom died within the year, Whether they died from the curse or from the coincidence of pre-existing illness is a matter of perspective. The Templar order was dissolved by papal decree in 1312. Their assets were transferred to the Knights Hospitaller. Their houses were seized. Their members were scattered, imprisoned, executed, or, in some countries outside France, where the trials were conducted with less enthusiasm, simply released. And then the questions began. Were the charges true? The confessions obtained under torture are unreliable by any evidentiary standard. The specific charges, the idol Baphomet, the denial of Christ, the obscene rituals, are precisely the kind of charges that medieval authorities leveled against anyone they wished to destroy, from heretics to Jews to accused witches. The formulaic nature of the accusations suggests propaganda rather than documented practice. But something happened during those 7 years of trials that has never been fully explained. In 1308, Pope Clement V granted an amnesty to any Templar who would confess fully and seek forgiveness. Most Templars who appeared before the Papal Commission did exactly this. They confessed, but what they confessed to was not the lurid heresy of the official charges. They confessed to irregularities in the initiation ceremony, specifically to a practice in which new initiates were required, as part of their ceremony, to deny Christ 3 times. The Templars themselves explained this as a test, a preparation for the possibility of capture by Saracen forces who might demand exactly this denial as a condition of release. The denial in the ceremony, they said, was not genuine. It was practice, perhaps, but the consistency of this specific confession across hundreds of nights in multiple countries, questioned by different interrogators, is striking. Something did happen in the Templar initiation that was unusual, that the initiates were instructed to keep secret, and that involved at minimum the form of a denial of the Christian faith. What the full meaning of that ritual was, we do not know. And then there is the question of the treasure. The Knights Templar were among the wealthiest institutions in medieval Europe. They owned properties across France, England, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and the Crusader states. They had developed sophisticated financial instruments, an early form of international banking, issuing letters of credit that could be redeemed across the entire Christian world. They held assets on a scale that made even kings dependent on their financial services. When Philip the Fortune ordered their arrest, his agents seized their houses and their local assets. But the central treasury, the accumulated wealth of nearly 2 centuries of donations, banking fees, and the proceeds of their vast landed estates, was not found. It has never been found. The records of the order's finances are incomplete. Some documents were destroyed. Some may have been taken out of France before the arrests. There is a tradition, difficult to verify, that a group of Templar knights left La Rochelle by ship in the days immediately before October 13th, carrying something significant. Where they went, if they went anywhere, is unknown. The treasure has been sought for 700 years. Portugal, Scotland, Switzerland, the Americas. Oak Island in Nova Scotia, where a peculiar earthwork that may or may not be man-made has attracted treasure hunters for 2 centuries. Each location has its advocates and its reasons. None has produced the treasure. Where did it go? The most likely answer is the least romantic one. It did not go anywhere dramatic. It was distributed, concealed in local caches, spent, absorbed into other accounts in ways that left no clear trail. Institutions that were suppressed suddenly did not typically have orderly final audits. But the most likely answer is not the only answer, and 700 years of failed searches have not ruled out the alternative. The secrets of the Templars remain exactly that. In 2003, the Vatican released a document called the Chinon Parchment, a record of a secret. papal inquiry into the Templars in 1308, which showed that Pope Clement V had privately absolved the Templar leadership of heresy while publicly allowing the trials to continue. The document had been misfiled in the Vatican secret archives for 700 years. 700 years. Misfiled in an archive. That raises the obvious question, what else is in that archive? The Vatican Apostolic Archive, until 2019 called the Vatican Secret Archive, a name that has always been slightly misleading since the Latin secretum means private rather than secret, contains 85 kilometers of shelving holding documents from the 8th century to the present. Access is restricted to credentialed scholars who must apply in advance and work in a supervised reading room, requesting specific documents by catalog number. What they cannot request is what they don't know is there. The Chinon parchment was misfiled for 700 years. It was there, in the archive, accessible to anyone who knew exactly which box to look in. Nobody knew which box to look in. How many other misfiled documents are in 85 kilometers of shelving? What else has been sitting there, in the dark of the archive, waiting for someone to look in the right box? The Vatican has never published a complete catalog of its holdings. It probably never will. The archive continues to accept new deposits. The records of the modern papacy, like those of every papacy before it, flow continuously into those 85 kilometers of shelving. And somewhere in the older sections, in the boxes from the 13th and 14th and 15th centuries, there may be documents that would change our understanding of the medieval world completely. We do not know what they are. We do not know if they are there. We know only that the archive is very large and very old and has already surprised us once. From the sealed archives of Rome, we travel north to England and to a mystery that has puzzled historians and physicians for 500 years because it struck without warning, killed within hours, and then disappeared as completely as the princes in the tower. Chapter 5. The Sweating Sickness. In August of 1485, a few days after Henry VII's forces had defeated Richard III at Bosworth Field and the Tudor dynasty had begun, a new and unfamiliar disease appeared in London. It moved fast. The sweating sickness, as it came to be called, killed within hours of the first symptoms. A person could wake healthy in the morning and be dead by afternoon. The symptoms, as described by contemporary physicians, which is to say, described badly and in terms that reflect medieval medical understanding rather than modern diagnostic categories, included sudden onset of cold shivers, followed by a profuse and fetid sweat, headache, pain in the neck and shoulders, exhaustion, and delirium. The sweating itself was the central feature. The body seemed to be expelling something, pouring liquid out of every pore. If you sweated through the first 24 hours and survived, you were generally safe. If you fell asleep during the acute phase, you often did not wake up. Contemporary advice, which may have been correct, was to keep the patient awake and keep them sweating, on the theory that the disease was purging something that needed to be expelled. The 1485 outbreak killed thousands. It struck London hard, then spread through England. It spared certain groups. The English seemed particularly vulnerable, while foreigners in England were less affected, which was noted at the time with the kind of nervous interest that always accompanies epidemics that appear to discriminate. And then it receded. It returned in 1508, again in 1517, again in 1528, when it spread not just through England, but through much of continental Europe, reaching as far east as Poland and Lithuania, killing tens of thousands before receding again, and once more in 1551, in a final outbreak that was severe in England but did not spread further. After 1551, the sweating sickness was never seen again. In 500 years, it has not recurred. What was it? This is one of the most genuinely puzzling questions in the history of medicine. The sweating sickness was clearly distinct from plague. It spread differently, killed differently, and affected different populations. It was not typhus, not influenza, not smallpox, not any of the other epidemic diseases of the medieval and early modern period. The speed of its killing, hours from onset to death in severe cases, is unusual even among the most virulent infectious diseases we know. Proposed identifications have included anthrax, hantavirus, relapsing fever, and a novel virus that emerged in the late 15th century and then, for reasons unknown, went extinct. Each proposal has problems. None fits all the known characteristics. The hantavirus hypothesis, based on the similarity of some symptoms to hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, which is transmitted from rodent droppings and which has no person-to-person transmission, is interesting because it would explain the rapid killing and the severe respiratory involvement implied by the sweating. But hantavirus does not typically produce the pattern of epidemic spread that the sweating sickness showed. The most honest answer is that we do not know what the sweating sickness was. It appeared in England in 1485, struck 5 times over 66 years, killed an unknown number of people, possibly in the tens of thousands, and then disappeared entirely. One of its most famous near victims was Anne Boleyn, who contracted it during the 1528 epidemic and survived. Her husband-to-be, Henry VIII, who had an intense fear of disease and would flee the court at the first rumor of infection, retreated to his country houses and spent the epidemic writing anxious letters. A disease that came from nowhere, killed within hours, returned 5 times, and vanished. We will likely never know what it was, because to identify it, we would need a sample, a tissue sample, a blood sample, something preserved from one of the thousands of people it killed. Medieval bodies were buried in conditions that destroy organic material. The chance of finding preserved soft tissue from a sweating sickness victim is extraordinarily small. The disease took its secret with it. From the English epidemic that left no pathogen behind, we moved to France, to a trial that produced the most complete documentary record of any medieval legal proceeding, and to a verdict that many historians regard as one of the most profound miscarriages of justice in the Middle Ages. Chapter 6. The Trial of Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc was 19 years old when she was burned at the stake in the marketplace of Rouen on May 30th, 1431. The trial that condemned her lasted 5 months. The transcript runs to thousands of pages. It is one of the most extensively documented legal proceedings of the medieval period, a record so detailed that we know not just the charges and the verdict, but the questions asked and the answers given, the expressions of the examiners and the composure of the examined, the precise wording of the theological accusations and the precise wording of Joan's responses. She was charged with heresy. The specific charges centered on her wearing of male clothing, a violation of biblical law as interpreted by the Church, and on her claim that the visions and voices she heard came from God and from the saints rather than from the devil. The trial was conducted by ecclesiastical authorities operating under English political influence, in a city under English occupation, against a woman who had spent the previous 2 years leading French armies to victories that reversed the course of the 100 Years' War. The political context of the trial is not subtle, but it is the content of the trial, rather than the politics surrounding it, that has fascinated and disturbed historians for 6 centuries. Joan maintained throughout the entire 5-month proceeding that she heard voices, the voices of St. Catherine, St. Margaret, and St. Michael. They had come to her for the first time when she was approximately 13 years old, in her father's garden in Domremy, in a burst of light. They had told her that she would drive the English from France and see the Dauphin crowned king. She had obeyed. She had left her village. She had been granted an audience with the Dauphin. She had been given command of troops. She had led them to the relief of Orléans. She had stood beside Charles VII at his coronation in Reims. All of this had happened. Her examiners, experienced theologians, men who spent their professional lives evaluating claims of religious experience, questioned her extensively about the voices. Was it really St. Catherine? How did she know? What did the voices say exactly? What did they look like? Did they smell? Did they touch her? Joan's answers are remarkable for their consistency and their specificity. She described the voices with sensory precision. She distinguished between what she was permitted to reveal and what she was not. She pushed back against leading questions with a clarity of mind that impressed even some of her interrogators. Whether Joan actually heard voices is a question that cannot be answered from the historical record. What the historical record shows, with extraordinary clarity, is what Joan believed. And what Joan believed, with absolute and unshakable conviction, was that she had been sent by God to do exactly what she did. She was convicted. She recanted her claims initially, in a moment of weakness or tactical calculation, signing a document that acknowledged her voices might have been false, and was condemned to life imprisonment rather than death. Then within days, she withdrew the recantation. She resumed wearing male clothing, which she had agreed to give up. She said her voices had told her the recantation was wrong. She was burned as a relapsed heretic. 25 years later, in 1456, a retrial commissioned by the Pope and by King Charles VII of France, the same Charles she had crowned, reviewed the original proceedings and declared the verdict void. Joan was formally rehabilitated. 500 years later, in 1920, she was canonized as a saint of the Catholic Church. The woman burned as a heretic in the marketplace of Rouen is now Saint Joan. What the voices were, divine communication, the expression of a powerful psyche under enormous pressure, a neurological event of some kind, something else entirely, is a question that the retrial did not address and that no subsequent investigation has resolved. The record of her trial is one of the most intimate documents of the medieval period. For 5 months, a 19-year-old girl from a village in Lorraine answered questions put to her by the most learned theologians of her age, and the exchange was written down, word by word. She is present in it in a way that very few medieval people are present in the historical record. You can hear her voice. But the question she most matters to, what were those voices? Her voice cannot answer. From the voices that drove Joan to war, we move to a place of absolute silence, a monastery in France where, for reasons that have never been fully established, an entire community of monks was found dead one morning without any indication of how they died. Chapter 7. The Silence of the Monastery. The story of the silent monastery exists in several versions, attached to several different locations across medieval France, and this multiplicity is itself part of the mystery, because it suggests that something happened more than once in monastic communities of the medieval period that was remarkable enough to be remembered, but not well documented enough to be attached firmly to a single verifiable event. The most persistent version places the event at a small Cistercian monastery in the French countryside sometime in the 13th century. The monastery was found, one morning, by travelers seeking shelter, to be entirely silent. No bell had rung for matins. No smoke rose from the kitchen. The gates were unlocked, but no one came to them. The travelers entered. They found the monastery apparently undisturbed. The church was in order. The refectory was laid for a meal that had not been eaten. The scriptorium contained manuscripts in various stages of completion, the ink, dried on quills, laid carefully beside them. And in the church, in the choir stalls, in the cloister, in the cells, the monks, all dead, all in positions that suggested they had died quietly, without struggle, without warning, some apparently in the act of prayer, some in their cells, lying in their beds, some in the refectory, seated at the table before the uneaten meal. No marks of violence, no signs of disease, no explanation. This story, in its various forms, appears in chronicles and local histories across medieval France and Italy. The details vary, the number of monks, the precise location, the century. but the central elements are consistent enough that historians have taken seriously the possibility that it reflects a real type of event, even if the specific accounts are legendary elaborations. The most likely explanation, when historians and forensic scientists have examined similar cases from both the medieval period and from later centuries, is carbon monoxide poisoning. A faulty brazier, a blocked chimney, a cooking fire in an enclosed space. Carbon monoxide is colorless, odorless, and kills silently, especially in sleeping people, especially in enclosed stone buildings with poor ventilation. A monastery in winter, with fires burning in the kitchen and the warming room and the cells, with the thick stone walls holding the air still. The conditions for accidental carbon monoxide poisoning were present. But the versions of the story that come down to us describe monks in the choir stalls, monks in the act of walking, monks seated at a meal. Carbon monoxide poisoning of such speed and totality that people fell in the act of moving without any period of illness that would have caused them to seek help or make noise. This is possible in extreme cases, but is unusual. And there is another element in some versions of the story that carbon monoxide does not explain: the books. In several accounts, what disturbed the travelers most was not the bodies, but the manuscripts. The scriptorium was found with books open on the desks, work in progress, quills laid aside. But in some accounts, pages had been removed from the books, carefully removed, not torn, cut out, or unbound and taken. Specific pages, specific texts, specific passages, as if someone, before or after the deaths, had removed something. What was in those pages? That question cannot be answered from the versions of the story that survive, because the books themselves, if they ever existed, have not been identified. The story may be purely legendary, a morality tale, or a ghost story dressed in realistic details. But the detail of the removed pages is strange enough to linger, because if you were going to construct a fictional story about a monastery that died mysteriously, you would not necessarily think to add the detail of specific pages removed from specific books. It is too particular, too specific, too much like something that actually happened and was noticed and was written down because it was noticed. What was in those pages? The monastery is silent. From the silence of one institution, we move to the sounds of another, to the bells that rang in the city of London on a night when they should not have rung, and to the death that may or may not have caused them. Chapter 8. The mysterious death of Christopher Marlowe. Christopher Marlowe was not, strictly speaking, a medieval figure. He died in 1593, well into what historians call the early modern period. But the world he inhabited, the world of Tudor England, of religious persecution, of state intelligence networks, and secret Catholic networks, and the constant presence of the scaffold, was in many ways the last expression of medieval systems of power and belief, and his death is one of the most genuinely mysterious in the literature of that world. Marlowe was 29 years old when he died, and he was already the most celebrated playwright in England. Dr. Faustus, Tamburlaine, Edward II, the Jew of Malta. He had written more and arguably better than anyone else working in the London theatre, including the slightly younger man who was just beginning to attract attention in the same theatrical world, William Shakespeare. He died in a house in Deptford on May 30th, 1593, of a stab wound to the eye. The official account is recorded in a coroner's inquest conducted 2 days after his death. Marlowe had spent the day at the house of a widow named Eleanor Bull, with 3 other men, Ingram Fraser, Nicholas Skeers, and Robert Poley. They had eaten together, walked in the garden, eaten again. In the evening, a dispute arose over the bill, the reckoning. Fraser and Marlowe argued. The argument became physical. Marlowe seized Fraser's dagger. Fraser, defending himself, stabbed Marlowe above the right eye with his own dagger to a depth of 2 inches. Marlowe died immediately. Fraser was pardoned within the month on grounds of self-defense. Everything about this account is suspicious. Fraser, Scares, and Poley were all connected in various documented ways to the Elizabethan intelligence service. Robert Poley in particular was a known government agent who had played a central role in uncovering the Babington plot, the Catholic conspiracy against Queen Elizabeth I, just 7 years earlier. The gathering at Eleanor Bull's house was not a casual lunch among friends. These were not casual men. Marlowe himself had been called before the Privy Council just 10 days before his death, under suspicion of atheism and possibly of connections to treasonous activity. His roommate, the playwright Thomas Kidd, had been arrested and tortured, and under torture had implicated Marlowe in the possession of heretical documents. Marlowe was not imprisoned, but was required to report daily to the council while the investigation continued. The investigation ended with his death. Why was Marlowe in that room with 3 government agents on the day he died? Was his death genuinely the result of a dispute over a meal bill, a quarrel so trivial and so sudden that it ended the life of England's greatest playwright? Or was the gathering arranged, the killing planned, and the inquest a convenient fiction to close a case that the government wished closed? Scholars have debated this for 4 centuries. The theory that Marlowe's death was arranged by the government, by enemies in the theatrical or political world, by Catholic or Protestant factions whose interests he threatened, has never been proven, but it has also never been convincingly ruled out. The inquest record is too neat. The pardon came too fast. The 3 men present were too connected to state intelligence for their presence to be coincidental. And there is one more theory, beloved of a particular strain of literary scholarship, that adds a further layer of strangeness. That Marlowe did not die at all, that the death was faked, that Marlowe, facing arrest and possibly execution for heresy or treason, was spirited out of England with government complicity and continued his writing career under the name of an obscure Stratford actor, William Shakespeare. This theory is not taken seriously by the scholarly mainstream, and for good reason. The evidence for it is thin, and the evidence against it is substantial. But it has persisted for over a century precisely because the circumstances of Marlowe's death are so opaque that alternatives feel, if not plausible, at least not entirely impossible. A dagger, above the right eye, in a room in Deptford, and everything that followed. The quick inquest, the quick pardon, the silence of the witnesses, closed around the event like water closing over a stone. From the sudden death of a playwright, we travel back in time and north in space, to Scotland, and to a disappearance that is in some ways even more complete than the princes in the tower, because in this case, even the names of the missing are uncertain. Chapter 9. The Lost Colony of Greenland. In 985 CE, a Norwegian chieftain named Eric the Red, having been exiled from Iceland for manslaughter, sailed west into uncharted waters and found a large island. He named it Greenland, an act of marketing in the medieval sense, designed to attract settlers to a place that was considerably less green than Iceland, but considerably more available. Settlers came. 2 main settlements were established on the southwestern coast of Greenland, the Eastern Settlement and the Western Settlement. And at their height, in the 11th and 12th centuries, these communities held perhaps 4,000 to 5,000 people. They farmed. They kept cattle and sheep and goats, straining the marginal land to support European livestock. They hunted walrus for ivory, which was a valuable export. They maintained contact with Europe, receiving regular trading ships and at least occasional visits from church officials. They built churches, the ruins of 16 medieval churches have been found in Greenland, including the Cathedral of Gardar, the seat of Greenland's bishop, whose walls still stand several meters high in the Greenlandic landscape. And then, gradually, in the 14th and 15th centuries, they disappeared. The Western settlement went first. Around 1350, a Norwegian priest named Ivar Bardsson sailed from the eastern settlement to investigate why contact with the western settlement had been lost. He found the settlement abandoned, houses standing, livestock, cattle, sheep, horses wandering untended, no people, no bodies either, no evidence of massacre, no evidence of epidemic, no evidence of anything except abandonment, rapid, apparently voluntary, and total. Where did they go? The eastern settlement lasted longer, into the mid-15th century. The last written record of Greenland's Norse community is a document from 1408, recording a marriage at Valsey Church, a ceremony witnessed by multiple named individuals in a church whose ruins are among the best preserved in Greenland, a wedding at the end of the world conducted with full ecclesiastical ceremony in a community that would be silent within decades. What ended them? Climate is the leading explanation. The medieval warm period that had made Greenland's marginal agriculture possible began cooling in the 13th and 14th centuries, part of the onset of what climatologists call the Little Ice Age. Summers shortened. The sea ice pushed further south, making the Atlantic crossings more dangerous, and eventually closing the trade routes entirely. The fields that had supported cattle became less productive. The walrus ivory that had given Greenland its trading value was undercut by African elephant ivory flooding European markets from the Portuguese coastal exploration of Africa. The economy of the settlements was attacked from every direction simultaneously. This explanation is compelling and probably largely correct, but it does not explain the manner of the disappearance. Populations under economic and environmental pressure do not typically vanish without trace. They struggle, they petition authorities, they send distress signals, they leave records of their difficulties. The Norse Greenlanders left almost nothing, a few skeletons from the final period showing signs of nutritional stress, and the wedding record from 1408, and then silence. Ivar Bardsson's account of finding the western settlement abandoned, with the livestock still there, with no evidence of the people who kept them, remains the most haunting detail of the whole history. The western settlement was not evacuated in an orderly way. If it had been, the livestock would have been taken or slaughtered, not left to wander. Something happened quickly. The Inuit peoples of Greenland, who arrived from the west during the same period and whose expansion down the coast of Greenland brought them into contact with the Norse settlements, have oral traditions that describe encounters with the Norse, but these traditions have not resolved the question of what happened at the end. 4,000 to 5,000 people in a community that had existed for nearly 5 centuries disappeared without leaving an explanation. The churches still stand. The cathedral walls still rise above the Greenlandic tundra, and whatever the last Norse Greenlander saw and thought and decided in the years before the silence fell, we will very likely never know. From the cold silence of Greenland, we move to a silence of a completely different kind, to the English village of Ayam, which in 1666 made a decision so extraordinary that it altered the course of English history, and whose full human consequences have never been adequately recorded. Chapter 10. The Village That Sealed Itself. In September of 1665, a bale of cloth arrived in the village of Ayam in Derbyshire, England, sent from London to a local tailor named Alexander Hadfield. The cloth was damp, and Hadfield's assistant, George Vickers, hung it before the fire to dry. Within days, Vickers was dead. The plague, the bubonic plague, the Black Death, the same disease that had killed a third of Europe 300 years earlier, and that still erupted periodically in English cities, had arrived in Ayam. The death spread. By the end of October, 5 more villagers were dead. Through the winter, the deaths continued. The following spring and summer, the plague accelerated. August of 1666 was the worst month. 78 people died in 30 days, in a village of perhaps 700. And here is the decision. The village rector, William Mompesson, and the previous rector, Thomas Stanley, persuaded the village to quarantine itself, to seal its own borders, to allow no one to leave Ayam so that the plague could not spread to the surrounding countryside. The villagers agreed. Food and supplies were left at the village boundaries by neighboring communities, in exchange for coins left in water or vinegar, in the belief that the liquid would neutralize any contagion on the money. The villagers held their church services outdoors, in a natural amphitheater in the hills, to reduce the concentration of infected air. The dead were buried by their own families, in the fields where they fell, rather than in the churchyard, to reduce contact between the living. The quarantine held for 14 months. When it finally ended, approximately 260 of Ayam's estimated 700 residents were dead, roughly a third of the village. The surrounding countryside was largely spared. Ayam is remembered as a story of heroic sacrifice, and it was. The decision to seal the village was genuinely extraordinary, a collective choice to accept probable death in order to protect others, made by ordinary people in a moment of extraordinary clarity. But the full human record of those 14 months has never been recovered. We know the names of many who died, from the records Mompesson kept, and from the family grave markers in the fields. We know the sequence of the deaths. We know the broad outlines of the community's decisions. What we do not know, what no record preserves, is the interior of those 14 months. The arguments that must have happened, the moments when people wanted to break the quarantine and were persuaded not to, the nights when families buried their own dead in the field and came back inside and waited. Mompesson's wife Catherine died in August 1666. At the height of the worst month, he buried her himself. What he thought, what he felt, what he said to himself in the silence after, the record does not say. The village of Ayam still stands. The boundary stones that mark the quarantine perimeter are still visible in the hills. The graves in the fields are still there. The Riley graves, where an entire family is buried in a plot their surviving mother dug herself. The village kept its secret in the most complete way, by surviving it, and by leaving, in the records of the dead, only the fact of the dying, and not the texture of the living through it. From the sealed village, we move to a sealed document, or rather, to a coded text that was found in the possession of a man who was executed for treason, and whose cipher was not broken for 370 years. Chapter 11, the code that took 3 centuries to break. In 1587, a Scottish nobleman named Sir John Trevanion was executed for his part in a conspiracy against Queen Elizabeth the Poor's. Among his possessions at the time of his arrest was a letter, apparently innocuous, from a friend expressing hope for his eventual release. The letter was examined by the authorities, who found nothing suspicious in it. It was returned to Trevanion's family. The letter contained a hidden message. Specifically, if you counted 3 letters after each punctuation mark in the text and wrote down those letters in sequence, you got an instruction. Panel at east end of chapel slides. Trevanion, imprisoned in Colchester Castle, awaiting execution, received the letter and followed the instruction. He found the sliding panel. He escaped. He was recaptured and executed anyway, but the letter and the method embedded in it survived. This story is perhaps apocryphal. It has been told in various forms and is not fully verified by contemporary documents, but it points to something that is thoroughly documented across the medieval and early modern period: the practice of hiding messages in plain sight, of encoding communication in ways that could pass inspection if intercepted, of maintaining secret channels of information within and between institutions that operated under surveillance and suspicion. The medieval world was full of codes. Some of them were practical. Merchants used private ciphers to protect trade information from competitors. Diplomats used encrypted communication to prevent their negotiations from being read if intercepted. Spies and agents used whatever system their handlers gave them. Some of them were ideological. Communities under persecution, crypto-Jews in Spain after the Reconquista, Lollards in England, Cathars in southern France, developed private languages and signals to identify each other and to maintain their practices under official prohibition. And some of them were something else. The Copiale cipher is a manuscript of 105 pages, written in a mixture of Roman and Greek letters interspersed with abstract symbols, that was discovered in the East Berlin Academy after German reunification. It dated from the early 18th century, making it technically post-medieval, but the tradition it represented stretched back centuries. The manuscript was solved in 2011 by a team of computer scientists using statistical analysis. It turned out to be the ritual document of a secret society, possibly connected to the Freemasons or their precursors, describing elaborate initiation ceremonies, symbolic rituals, and oaths of secrecy. 300 years of opacity, 3 centuries of a document sitting in an archive, examined by scholars, appearing to be meaningless. And then a computer, and a statistical model, and suddenly the words emerge. The Voynich manuscript has not yet yielded to this treatment. Neither have several other coded or apparently coded documents from the medieval period, texts that appear to be written in systems rather than randomly, that have the statistical characteristics of meaning, but that have not yet been decoded. What are they? Ritual documents, like the Copiale cipher, protecting the practices of groups who feared persecution, personal ciphers used by individuals to protect their private thoughts from the eyes of others, something else, some tradition of encoded knowledge that existed in the margins of medieval intellectual life outside the official channels of church and court. The medieval world had many margins. Many of the things that happened in them were deliberately obscured. How many codes are still waiting to be solved? How many of the documents that sit in archives across Europe, catalogued, preserved, photographed, are carrying meanings that no one has yet extracted? The archive is very large. The codes are patient. From the hidden messages of the medieval world, we move to the most famous of all medieval mysteries, a treasure that may or may not exist, a location that may or may not be findable, and a legend that has proven resistant to both discovery and debunking for nearly 700 years. Chapter 12. The Holy Grail. The Holy Grail is the most famous object in medieval legend. It appears in different forms in different sources, sometimes a cup or chalice used by Christ at the Last Supper and by Joseph of Arimathea to catch the blood of Christ at the crucifixion, sometimes a dish or platter, sometimes a stone, sometimes a book. The earliest Grail romances, written in the late 12th and early 13th centuries by poets like Chrétien de Troyes and Wolfram von Eschenbach, present an object of mysterious and transformative power connected to the Arthurian court, sought by the Knights of the Round Table, capable of healing and of providing miraculous sustenance and of conferring on those pure enough to behold it an experience of the divine. The Grail romances are literary works. They are fiction. The scholars of medieval literature who study them are studying a literary tradition, not a historical record. But the question of whether the literary tradition has any connection to a real object, a real cup, a real relic of some kind that inspired the stories, or that the stories were written to point toward, is one that has attracted not just romantic speculation, but serious historical inquiry. The connection most commonly made is between the Grail and the Knights Templar. Wolfram von Eschenbach, in his version of the Grail story called Parzival, describes the Grail's guardians in terms that bear some resemblance to the military religious orders. The Templars were in the Holy Land. They were in Jerusalem. They had access, if any medieval institution did, to objects and knowledge from the period of the early church. Whether the Templars actually possessed any such object or knew of any such object is entirely unknown. Their surviving records, extensive by medieval standards, contain no reference to a sacred cup or to any object matching Grail descriptions. But the Templar records are not complete. Much was destroyed in 1307, and the tradition that connects the Templars to the Grail has proven extraordinarily persistent, most recently in the novels of Dan Brown, which, however inaccurate they may be in specifics, have kept the question in public consciousness. There are objects that have been seriously proposed as the actual Grail, or at least as the actual cup used by Christ at the Last Supper, which is not quite the same as the literary Grail, but is closer to what a historical inquiry would be looking for. The most serious candidate, in terms of the scholarship that has been applied to it, is a chalice in the Cathedral of Valencia in Spain, known as the Holy Chalice of Valencia. It is an agate cup, clearly ancient. Scientific analysis has dated the agate to the 1st century of the Common Era, roughly consistent with the period of the Last Supper. It has been in Valencia since the 15th century, having arrived in Spain via Aragon, and before that via the papacy, with a documented chain of custody going back to the 11th century and a claimed, though not independently verified, chain going back to Rome. Medieval popes celebrated Mass with this cup. Several important pilgrims made specific journeys to venerate it. It was taken seriously by people who had access to the best historical knowledge of their era as a genuine relic. Whether it is what it is claimed to be cannot be verified by any available method. Agate cups of this type were made in the 1st century. They were also made in subsequent centuries. The provenance before the 11th century is a claim, not a document. The Holy Grail, as a literary object, is everywhere, in the poems and the novels and the films. As a historical object, it may be in Valencia, it may be somewhere else. It may not exist in physical form at all. The legend persists because the questions it embeds, what is the most sacred thing? Where is it? Who is worthy of it? Are questions that the human mind does not give up easily. From the legend of the Grail, we move to a historical figure who has been mythologized nearly as completely, and whose actual documented history is in some ways more disturbing than any legend. Chapter 13. The real Vlad the Impaler. Vlad III, Prince of Wallachia, known in his own time by various epithets and known to subsequent centuries primarily as Vlad the Impaler or Dracula, was a 15th century ruler of the region that is now southern Romania. He was born around 1428 and died in 1476 or early 1477, under circumstances that are themselves mysterious. In between, he ruled Wallachia 3 times, was imprisoned twice, fought the Ottoman Turks with a ferocity that made him a hero to some of his contemporaries and a monster to others, and committed acts of violence that were extraordinary even by the standards of a violent century. The impalement, the practice of driving a stake through the body of a living person and erecting the stake so that the victim died slowly, was not invented by Vlad. It was a method of execution used across the medieval world by Ottoman authorities, among others. What made Vlad unusual was the scale and the apparent deliberateness of his use of it, and the particular staging of mass impalement as a psychological weapon. The most famous account, which may be partly propagandistic but is corroborated in general terms by multiple independent sources, describes the forest of the impaled that Vlad erected outside the city of Târgoviște in 1462 when the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II advanced into Wallachia with an overwhelming force. The forest consisted of thousands of impaled bodies. Some accounts say 20,000, some say 30,000, arranged in concentric circles, with the bodies of the highest-ranking prisoners at the center on the tallest stakes. Mehmed, who had just conquered Constantinople and was by no measure a squeamish man, reportedly turned his army around and left. The psychological warfare worked, whether Vlad's violence was the calculated strategy of a ruler trying to defend an indefensible position against a vastly superior power, or the expression of a genuinely sadistic character, or some combination that the historical record does not allow us to fully disentangle. This is a question that historians have been asking for 500 years without consensus. But the mystery of Vlad III is not primarily about his violence. It is about his death and about what happened afterward. Vlad died in late 1476 or early 1477 during a battle or an ambush near Bucharest. He was killed by Ottoman forces. This much is known. His burial place is not known. Contemporary sources mentioned that he was buried at the island monastery of Snagov, north of Bucharest, which has a documented connection to Vlad and which was excavated in 1931. The excavation found a grave in the expected location that contained human remains dressed in fragments of embroidered clothing consistent with 15th century Wallachian noble dress. But the skull was missing, and a subsequent excavation in a different part of the monastery found another possible grave with remains that showed signs of being associated with elite burial. Which grave, if either, is Vlad's, is not established. His head may have been sent to Constantinople. The Ottomans customarily displayed the heads of significant enemies, and there are accounts that Vlad's head was taken after his death. Where his body actually lies is not known. And then there is the other question, the literary question, the one that has made his name famous far beyond the specialists who study 15th century Wallachian history. Bram Stoker, writing his novel Dracula in 1897, drew on the name and some of the reputation of Vlad III for his vampire count. The connection is looser than popular culture suggests. Stoker was not writing historical fiction and knew relatively little about the actual Vlad. But the name stuck. Dracula, the devil's son, the name from a chivalric order, the Order of the Dragon, of which Vlad's father was a member. The real Vlad Dracula is now almost impossible to separate from the fictional Count Dracula. The vampire has consumed the prince. What remains under the mythology is a 15th century ruler of a small Balkan principality who died in battle and was buried somewhere that no one has definitively located, in a grave that may or may not have a head, in a monastery on an island north of Bucharest. His skull, if it was taken, is somewhere, or it is dust. The monastery of Snagov is very quiet. From a prince whose burial place is unknown, we move to a king whose burial place was unknown for 500 years, and was found in the most improbable location in 2012. Chapter 14, The King Under the Car Park. On September 12, 2012, archaeologists working in a car park in the city of Leicester, England, began to excavate. They were looking for the remains of Greyfriars Friary, a medieval Franciscan church that had been dissolved during Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries in the 16th century. The church had been demolished and built over, and its exact location had been uncertain for centuries. On the first day of excavation, in the first trench they found a skeleton. DNA analysis, osteological examination, and historical corroboration eventually confirmed what seemed improbable when the skeleton was found. It was Richard III, the last Plantagenet king of England, killed at the Battle of Bosworth Field in 1485, whose body had been buried in the Greyfriars Friary by his enemies and then lost when the friary was demolished, found in a car park in Leicester in the first trench on the first day. The skeleton told a detailed story. Richard had scoliosis, a curvature of the spine that would have made his right shoulder appear higher than his left, consistent with the descriptions of his physical appearance in historical sources. He, not the monstrous hunchback of Shakespeare's famous portrayal, but his condition was real and noticeable. He had died from multiple trauma wounds to the skull, consistent with being struck by weapons from multiple directions. The pattern of the wounds suggests he had lost his helmet in the final moments of battle and been surrounded. Several of the wounds were severe enough to be immediately fatal. At least one, a slice through the base of the skull, was inflicted after death, consistent with the deliberate mutilation of a defeated enemy. He had been buried in a hurry. The grave was slightly too short for his body. His head was propped against the end, and his hands may have been bound behind him at burial. There were no coffin remnants, no grave goods. His enemies had buried him quickly, without ceremony, in a friary whose friars would presumably have prayed over him but could not give him the burial of a king. He had been in that car park, in that grave, under the paved surface, under the vehicles that parked over him every day, for 527 years. He is now in Leicester Cathedral, in a tomb that gives him the ceremony his burial lacked. But the discovery raises the question that sits underneath it. If Richard III could be lost for 527 years in a city that was continuously inhabited, in a country with relatively good historical records, what else is lost in plain sight? How many medieval graves lie under car parks and roads and buildings in cities across Europe, containing the remains of people who were significant in their time and are now forgotten? The car park in Leicester was not a remote or obscure location. It was in the center of a medium-sized English city. People parked there every day for decades. And under it, in a grave slightly too small for him, a king waited. From the king found under a car park, we come to a mystery that has no body, no car park, no location, only a name and a series of deaths and a silence that has lasted 7 centuries. Chapter 15, The Black Death and Its Darkest Questions. In 1347, ships from the Black Sea arrived in Messina, Sicily. The sailors were dead or dying, covered in black swellings that oozed blood and pus. The harbor master ordered the ships out of the port. It was too late. The Black Death, the catastrophic pandemic of 1347 to 1351, and the subsequent outbreaks that continued throughout the latter half of the 14th century, killed between 30 and 60% of Europe's population. At the low estimate, this was 30 million people. At the high estimate, it was 50 million. Some regions lost more than half their populations. Some villages ceased to exist entirely, their last. Survivors dying alone in houses that were then abandoned and eventually collapsed. The scale of mortality is difficult to comprehend in modern terms. Imagine every third person you know dying within 5 years. Imagine a third of your city gone. The Black Death was caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, transmitted primarily by fleas carried by rats. This is now established beyond serious doubt. Ancient DNA from medieval plague burials has confirmed the pathogen, but certain aspects of the Black Death remain genuinely mysterious, even now, even with modern tools. The speed and completeness of the spread. Bubonic plague, the flea-borne form, spreads relatively slowly, moving only as fast as infected rats and their fleas can travel. The speed with which the Black Death moved through Europe in 1347 to 1350, crossing the continent in roughly 3 years, reaching as far as Iceland, is difficult to explain through flea-borne transmission alone. Some researchers have argued that the pandemic involved not just bubonic, but also pneumonic plague, the airborne form, spread through respiratory droplets, which moves far faster and kills even more quickly. The pneumonic form is caused by the same bacterium, but infects the lungs rather than the lymph nodes, and it can spread directly from person to person without the rat flea intermediary. Medieval descriptions of the disease's spread, accounts of people dying after brief contact with the sick, of entire households dying within days of the first case, are more consistent with pneumonic than bubonic spread. But the clinical descriptions of the swellings, the buboes, point to bubonic. Perhaps both forms were circulating simultaneously. Perhaps the pandemic was a mixed epidemic of both pneumonic and bubonic, interacting in ways that amplified the mortality beyond what either alone would have produced. Or perhaps there was a third element. Some historians and paleobiologists have suggested that the Black Death pathogen of the 14th century was not quite the same as modern Yersinia pestis, that it was a more virulent strain or a co-infection with another pathogen that explains the extraordinary mortality rates of the 14th century compared to subsequent plague outbreaks. What happened in the communities that were most severely affected is documented in chronicles and in the archaeology of mass graves, burials where hundreds of bodies were interred simultaneously without the careful individual preparation that Christian burial normally required, because there were simply not enough living people to bury the dead properly. Mass graves have been found across Europe, at Smithfield in London, at East Smithfield just outside the city walls, at Ayam's predecessors in plague history across England and France. The bones in these graves show the physical toll of the disease. Bodies that were young and old, male and female, apparently healthy before the infection, dying close together in time. What they do not show is what the dying thought. The medieval chroniclers wrote about this. The Florentine Giovanni Boccaccio, who lived through the 1348 outbreak in his city, described in the preface to the Decameron a city that had abandoned its own social fabric, where the dying were left alone by those who feared contagion, where bodies lay in the streets, where the social order that defined medieval life had simply ceased to function. The fear, the abandonment, the complete disruption of everything that people understood as normal. This is documented. But the experience of the individual in the middle of it, the woman who watched her children die before her, the priest who gave last rites to 100 dying people before dying himself, this is present only in fragments, in the texts of those lucky and literate enough to write. Most of the dead left nothing. The Black Death left a silence in the historical record, a silence made, not of secrecy, but of the simple fact that a third of the people who might have written things down were dead. From the mass death of the plague, we move to a death that was very singular, the death of a single woman who, if the documents are correct, lived for an almost impossibly long time, and whose life raises questions that historians have found difficult to answer and difficult to leave alone. Chapter 16. The Woman Who Would Not Die. In the parish records of a small town in the south of France, a woman named Jeanne de Belleville appears in documents spanning the late 13th to the mid-14th century, a period of roughly 60 to 70 years. She is not the subject of any major historical chronicle. She appears in local records, a property transaction here, a church contribution there, the kind of documentation that accumulates around a person of modest local significance across a long life, except that the span of years implied by the documentation is, for the medieval period, almost impossibly long. If the earliest and latest documents refer to the same person, and the name and the location make this the most natural reading, Jeanne de Belleville would have been active in local affairs into her 90s or beyond, at a time when life expectancy was dramatically lower than today and extreme longevity was vanishingly rare. This particular case has not attracted significant scholarly attention and may resolve into a simple explanation. Two women with the same name, in the same area, whose records have been conflated. This is the simplest and most likely answer, but it points to a broader and more genuinely mysterious phenomenon in medieval records: the occasional appearance of individuals who appear to live for an implausibly long time, whose documentation spans periods that are hard to account for. Medieval record keeping was inconsistent, and the same name in the same location over a long period does not always refer to the same person. Families named sons and daughters after parents and grandparents, creating chains of identical names in single communities. Documents were sometimes misdated, or the dates are misread by later transcribers. But not every anomalous record is explainable in these ways. There are cases scattered across medieval European records where a named individual appears to be present in documents across a span of time that exceeds any normal human lifespan, sometimes by decades. Some of these cases have been resolved by subsequent scholarship, showing multiple individuals sharing names. Others have not been resolved. The medieval world was fascinated by the possibility of extreme longevity. Its literature was full of characters who lived for centuries: Merlin, the wandering Jew, various saints who did not age normally. These were understood as supernatural, as the product of divine favor or diabolic compact. But the documentary anomalies in the records suggest something more mundane and more interesting: that in the gaps and inconsistencies of medieval record keeping, certain identities could persist beyond the span of a single life, whether deliberately or accidentally, whether the person in the later document was the same person as in the earlier one, or someone who claimed to be, or simply someone whose name was the same and whose records became entangled. The records are not always what they appear to be, and what they conceal in those entanglements is sometimes more interesting than what they reveal. From the anomalies in medieval records, we move to the end of the medieval period, to an event that was recorded at the time, debated immediately, and has never been fully resolved in the 5 centuries since. Chapter 17. The disappearance of the Amber Room's medieval predecessor. This mystery begins not in the medieval period proper, but in its shadow, in the century immediately following, when the medieval world's long habit of hiding things was applied to an object of incalculable value. The medieval world accumulated relics, the bones of saints, fragments of the true cross, the thorns from the crown of thorns, the finger of John the Baptist, the milk of the Virgin Mary. These objects were not merely symbolic, they were understood to be physically present with divine power, to heal, to protect, to intercede. They were kept in reliquaries of extraordinary beauty and expense, gold and silver and jeweled containers shaped like body parts, like towers, like tiny churches, that held the sacred fragment within and displayed it to the devout. The most important relics were the most carefully guarded objects in the medieval world. And as the medieval world ended, as the Reformation began, as Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries, as Protestant armies swept through Catholic Europe, destroying what they regarded as idolatry, the most important relics were hidden. Some were hidden permanently. The location of the hiding was known to one person, who died before telling another. The most significant example is the veil of Veronica, the cloth, according tradition, with which a woman wiped the face of Christ on the way to Calvary, and on which his image was miraculously imprinted. The veil was kept at St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, displayed publicly 4 times a year, and venerated by pilgrims from across the Christian world. In 1527, when the troops of Holy Roman Emperor Charles V sacked Rome in one of the most catastrophic events of the early modern period, the Vatican was looted. Objects were taken. The record of what happened to the veil during the sack is confused. After the sack, the Vatican claimed the veil was still in Rome, still in their possession, but the reliquary that had held it was empty, and the subsequent history of the object in Rome is, by any standard, extremely murky. What the Vatican shows today as the Veil of Veronica is, by the assessment of most scholars of early Christian art, not the same object that was displayed before 1527. The original, if it existed as a distinct physical object rather than a tradition accumulated around a cloth that was itself symbolic, disappeared during or after the sack, where perhaps it was destroyed by soldiers who did not care about it. Perhaps it was taken by a soldier who subsequently lost it or sold it. Perhaps it was hidden deliberately by Vatican officials during the chaos of the sack, in a location that was recorded in a document that has since been lost. The veil joins a long list of medieval relics whose fate after the Reformation is unknown. Objects that were hidden or seized or destroyed during the religious upheavals of the 16th century and that have not been seen since. The medieval world's most important objects went underground. Most of them have not come back up. From the relics that disappeared, we come to our final mystery, and the one that is, in some ways, the most unsettling of all, because it has no dramatic event, no crime, no treasure, no document. It has only a pattern in the landscape of medieval England that no one has fully explained. Chapter 18. The Lost Villages. Across the English countryside, there are shadows. Not literal shadows, but the traces of something that was once present and is no longer. Earthwork ridges in fields that mark where streets once ran. Slight depressions in the grass that were once the foundations of houses. The outline of a church, still just visible under the turf, in the right light, in the right season, when the grass grows slightly differently over the stone below. These are the lost villages of medieval England. Historians estimate that between 3,000 and 5,000 settlements that existed in medieval England were subsequently abandoned, emptied out, and left to grass over, their populations gone, their buildings fallen, their names surviving only in old documents and occasionally in the name of a nearby field or a lane that still goes to where the village used to be. The most significant cause is the Black Death. When the plague of 1347 to 1350 killed between a third and a half of the population of England, some villages were reduced below the threshold of viability, to populations so small that the remaining inhabitants could not maintain the social and agricultural infrastructure that made settlement life possible. In some cases, the plague returned 2 or 3 times in the following decades, finishing what the first outbreak had begun. The survivors of these near-extinct communities moved to nearby villages that were larger and still functioning. The emptied villages were converted to pasture. Sheep grazing required less labor than arable farming, and in a period of severe labor shortage, landowners found sheep economically attractive. Fields that had grown wheat and barley for centuries were given over to wool production. The houses were dismantled for building material. The street patterns disappeared under grass. Within a generation or two, most people did not know that a settlement had been there. The most extensively studied of the lost villages is Warham Percy in North Yorkshire. Excavated over nearly 50 years beginning in the 1950s, Warham Percy has yielded a detailed picture of a medieval village from its origins in the pre-conquest period to its final abandonment around 1500. The causes of its abandonment were complex. The Black Death played a role, but the final depopulation appears to have been driven by deliberate clearance by the landowners. But what Warham Percy also revealed in the careful excavation of its churchyard was something unexpected. Among the human remains in the churchyard, which covered multiple centuries of burial, were some that showed signs of deliberate mutilation after death. Bones that had been cut, skulls that had been separated from the spine, bodies that appeared to have been dismembered and then reassembled in the grave in a way that suggested the mutilation was deliberate and post-mortem. The archaeologists who found this evidence and who published their analysis in 2017 proposed that the mutilation was connected to beliefs about the reanimation of the dead. The medieval world believed in the revenant, the corpse that could rise from the grave and torment the living. This belief was not merely folkloric. It was taken seriously by medieval clergy, documented in chronicles, and the subject of genuine ecclesiastical concern. The remedies prescribed in the chronicles, cutting off the head, pinning the body with stakes, burning, were understood to prevent the corpse from walking. Were the mutilated dead of Warham, Percy, treated this way because someone in the community feared they would walk? If so, who? What had they done or been that made them threats and death? What did the people of Warham Percy know about their own dead that we do not? The bones cannot tell us. They can only show us that something was feared, and that the fear was specific enough to act on, in the dark, in the graveyard, with a knife. Chapter 19. The Voynich Botanical Gardens. Let us return to the Voynich manuscript for a moment, because there is something we did not say about it that deserves to be said slowly. The manuscript has been examined by some of the finest minds that the 20th and 21st centuries have produced in the fields of cryptography, linguistics, and computational analysis. The people who cracked the German Enigma machine during the Second World War looked at it. National Security Agency analysts examined it. Computer scientists at the world's leading universities have run every available statistical analysis on its text. None of them have decoded it. But in 2019, a scholar named Gerard Cheshire published a paper claiming to have done exactly that. He argued that the Voynich script represents a language he called Proto-Romance, a medieval form of the language family that gave rise to Spanish, French, Italian, and Portuguese, written in a non-standard phonetic system developed by a particular community, possibly in the context of a medieval religious women's community. The paper attracted enormous attention, and then it attracted enormous criticism. The linguistic community examined Cheshire's proposed translation and found that his readings were, in the judgment of specialists, far too flexible, that he was finding the language he expected to find by interpreting the script in ways that were not consistently applied, and that his translations could not be reproduced by anyone else working from the same manuscript. Cheshire maintains that his analysis is correct. The community of Voynich scholars remains unconvinced. The manuscript continues to resist. What makes this pattern particularly interesting is that Cheshire is not the first person to claim a successful decipherment. Over the centuries since the manuscript became publicly known, there have been dozens of such claims. Each one has attracted excitement. Each one has been examined. None has survived the examination. None has produced translations that other scholars can verify by independent application of the proposed method. This is not what happens with genuine decipherments. When Linear B was decoded by Michael Ventris in 1952, the method worked. Other scholars applied it to other tablets and got readable Greek. When the Rosetta Stone enabled the decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphics, the method worked across the entire corpus of hieroglyphic text. A genuine decipherment is reproducible. It does not require special pleading or flexible rules. The Voynich manuscript has not produced a reproducible decipherment, which leaves open the most uncomfortable possibility of all, that there is nothing to decipher, that the text was constructed to appear meaningful while encoding no meaning, a supremely sophisticated performance of language built by someone who understood statistical linguistics well enough to fake it, for reasons that were never recorded and are now permanently unknown. If this is true, the Voynich manuscript is perhaps the greatest act of deliberate mystification in the history of scholarship, a trap that has held every clever person who approached it for 600 years. If someone designed this trap, they succeeded beyond any reasonable expectation. and they did not leave a note explaining themselves. The manuscript sits in its library. The text runs on. The figures bathe in their pools. The unidentifiable plants grow in their unidentifiable gardens, saying something or saying nothing. 600 years and we still cannot tell. Chapter 20. The Children's Crusade. In 1212, something happened in the Rhine Valley of Germany and in northern France that has been debated by historians ever since, in part because the sources are fragmentary and contradictory, and in part because what the sources describe, if taken at face value, is deeply difficult to explain. A movement of children, the German movement, as recorded in chronicle sources, began with a young man named Nicholas of Cologne, who gathered a following of young people, described in the sources as children, though the medieval definition of childhood was elastic, and some of those who followed may have been adolescents or young adults, and led them south through the Alps toward the Mediterranean, proclaiming that they would cross the sea to the Holy Land and convert the Muslims through peaceful preaching, where the armies of the Crusades had failed through violence. They crossed the Alps. Many died in the crossing. The survivors reached Genoa, expecting the sea to part for them, allowing them to walk to the Holy Land on dry ground. The sea did not part. Some dispersed. Some tried to find passage on ships. Some made it to Pisa, then to Rome, where the Pope received them with bewilderment and sent them home. What became of them after that, the chronicle sources disagree. The French movement, associated with a figure named Stephen of Cloyes, is even more obscure in its details and its outcome. Stephen reportedly carried a letter he claimed was from Christ himself, and attracted a following of thousands, some sources say 30,000, who gathered at Vendôme and then marched to Marseille, where 7 ships were waiting for them. The ships sailed. The children, or the young people, or whatever we should call them, were never heard from again. Some later sources, writing decades after the event, reported that 2 of the 7 ships were wrecked in a storm and the passengers drowned. The other 5, according to these same late sources, sailed to North Africa, where the passengers were sold into slavery. These later sources are not contemporary. They may be fabrications. They may be half-remembered rumor. They may reflect what actually happened. What we know with reasonable confidence is this. In 1212, a significant movement of young people, inspired by what they understood as a divine calling, gathered in France and Germany, marched to the Mediterranean, and then scattered or disappeared. What drove them? The most careful modern historians have moved away from the romantic picture of innocent children on a spiritual adventure and towards something more complicated. The participants in the movement were probably not primarily young children. The sources that describe them as such were writing with their own theological agenda, emphasizing the purity and simplicity of their faith. They were more likely adolescents and young adults from poor rural families, people with no prospects and no land, drawn by a charismatic leader and by the intoxicating possibility that God had chosen them specifically to accomplish what armies had failed to do. But what happened to the French group? Where did the 7 ships go? The silence after the sailing is complete. 5 ships left Marseille carrying hundreds of young people in 1212. They have not been heard from since. Chapter 21. The Rood of Grace. In the Abbey of Boxley in Kent, England, there was a crucifix. It was called the Rood of Grace, and it had been in the abbey since the early 14th century. It was a famous object of pilgrimage. People traveled from across England and from the continent to pray before it, to seek healing, to make offerings. The crucifix was remarkable, the pilgrims said, because it moved. The figure of Christ on the cross would open and close its eyes. Its lips would move. Its hands and head would turn. At moments of particular devotional intensity, the figure seemed to respond, to look at the pilgrim, to communicate to be present in a way that a carved wooden figure ordinarily was not. This made the Rood of Grace one of the most venerated objects in England, and one of the most profitable for the abbey that housed it. In 1538, during the dissolution of the monasteries ordered by Henry VIII, the commissioners arrived at Boxley Abbey to take inventory of its contents and seize its assets for the crown. They took down the Rood of Grace, and they found, inside the figure, a mechanism, wires, levers, a system of internal controls that could be operated by a person concealed nearby, producing the movements, the eyes opening, the lips moving, the head turning, that the pilgrims had taken as miracles. The Rood of Grace was a machine. The abbot and monks of Boxley had been, for somewhere between 1 and 2 centuries, operating a mechanical puppet before which thousands of pilgrims had knelt in genuine devotion, making offerings, seeking healing, believing themselves to be in the presence of the miraculous. The commissioners displayed the mechanism publicly in Maidstone Marketplace and then in London, where it was mocked and destroyed. The incident became famous in the Protestant propaganda of the Reformation as evidence of Catholic fraud. But the questions it raises are more complex than the reformers cared to acknowledge. How did the mechanism work exactly? No detailed technical description survives. We know it produced convincing motion and that it required concealed operation. We do not know how sophisticated it was, how it was powered, or how many people were involved in operating it during the decades of its use. Who knew? Certainly some of the monks, the operators, whoever they were. But how many? Was it the whole community, in on a deliberate fraud? Or was the knowledge restricted to a very few, the others genuinely believing in the Rood's miraculous properties, even as they lived in the same building as the mechanism? And what did the monks who knew think about what they were doing? The simplest interpretation is cynical, a profitable fraud maintained for financial benefit, no more complicated than that. But the medieval relationship between image, relic, and sacred presence was not simple. The theology of religious images allowed for the idea that God might choose to work through a physical object, that a statue or a crucifix might genuinely become a locus of divine activity, a place where the holy was particularly present. The mechanism in this reading might have been understood by at least some of those who knew about it, not as a replacement for the miracle, but as a support for it, a physical means of expressing a spiritual truth that was also really happening. This does not make it less of a fraud by modern standards, but it makes the people who maintained it harder to categorize as simply cynical. The Rood of Grace was burned in 1538. Whatever it knew about its own operation, it kept. Chapter 22. The maps that show what should not be there. In 1513, an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis compiled a world map using, as he noted in his own annotations, sources that included maps captured from Christopher Columbus and maps of great antiquity whose origins he did not fully know. The Piri Reis map shows Europe, Africa, and the Americas, which is not unusual for a map from 1513, 2 decades after Columbus's first voyage. What is unusual is what it shows at the bottom. The southern portion of the map depicts a landmass with a roughly accurate coastline in the location where Antarctica would be, at a time when Antarctica was not officially discovered until 1820, more than 300 years after the map was made. This has attracted an enormous amount of attention and an enormous amount of speculation. The mainstream explanation is that the map conflates or confuses different source materials, that the southern landmass represents a mishmash of South America's southern tip, Terra Australis, the hypothetical southern continent that geographers had long assumed must exist to balance the northern landmasses, and simple cartographic convention that filled in unknown southern regions with land. In other words, it is not Antarctica. It is a combination of guesswork, convention, and the distortions that come from combining multiple imperfect source maps. This explanation is geographically and historically sound, but the detail that has made the map famous, that the depicted coastline bears some resemblance to the sub-ice coastline of Antarctica as revealed by modern sonar mapping of the seafloor beneath the ice sheet, remains striking enough to unsettle complete dismissal. Antarctica's ice sheet is deep and ancient. The bedrock beneath it was not surveyed until the second half of the 20th century, using technology that did not exist in 1513. If the Piri Reis map is showing something that resembles that bedrock coastline, it is showing something that no known civilization had the technology to survey. The rationalist explanation, that the resemblance is coincidental, that the eye finds patterns in noise, that the mapping of an imaginary southern continent and the actual shape of the Antarctic bedrock happen to have some overlap, is almost certainly correct. Almost certainly. But the map is from 1513, and Piri Reis said he used ancient sources that he could not identify. And what those ancient sources were, where they came from, how old they were, what they recorded, is not known. The map is in the Topkapi Palace Museum in Istanbul. It does not explain itself. It simply shows what it shows. Chapter 23. The sealed room in the castle. Across Europe, there are castles with rooms that have not been opened in centuries. Not locked, exactly. Not sealed in any dramatic sense. Simply unused, and then built around, and then forgotten, and then discovered by the next generation of owners or archaeologists who found, behind a wall or under a floor, a space that the records did not account for. The phenomenon is more common than most people realize. Medieval construction was not always systematically documented. Builders worked from tradition and from the instructions of their patrons, not from architectural blueprints that were filed in a central archive. When a castle was extended, the older sections were sometimes incorporated in ways that left pockets of enclosed space, rooms that were sealed off by new walls, passages that were blocked, vaults that were closed when the floor above was laid. Sometimes this was deliberate, sometimes it was accidental. The most famous example in England is at Glamis Castle in Scotland, where a persistent legend holds that one room, a secret room accessible only to the Earl of Strathmore and a small number of male heirs, contains something that has been concealed since the 17th century. The nature of the secret has been variously described as a monster, a deformed heir hidden from public view, a gambling debt, a sealed crypt, a priest's hole, and various other things. No one outside the family has ever confirmed what, if anything, is there. The family's official position has been, for centuries, that there is no secret room. The legend has been, for centuries, that there is. A Victorian guest at Glamis reportedly hung towels from every window visible from outside, and then, walking the interior of the castle, found several windows that did not correspond to any room she had been shown. The windows are still there. The rooms behind them, if rooms they are, have not been opened for public inspection. In France, in Germany, in Italy, in Spain, similar legends attached to similar castles. A room in a tower that was blocked off in the 14th century. A vault under a chapel that no one has entered since a document records its ceiling in 1387. A passage connecting two wings of a palace that was bricked up during renovations in the 16th century and whose existence was not discovered until the renovation work was done. Some of these, when eventually investigated, contain nothing more than rubble and the bones of small animals who found their way in and could not find their way out. Some contain abandoned furniture, discarded objects, the detritus of a period of occupation that ended for mundane reasons. Some contain things that are more difficult to explain. A cache of documents in a language that has taken scholars years to identify. A collection of objects whose purpose is not immediately apparent. Human remains in arrangements that suggest deliberate placement rather than accidental death. The medieval castle was a complex ecosystem of public and private, of the visible and the hidden. Its architecture reflected a world in which secrecy was not paranoia, but policy, in which the concealment of certain things from certain people was simply how power worked. The rooms that were sealed, and the reasons they were sealed, and what was put in them before they were sealed, these are not always recoverable. The walls that were built to hide something are often stronger than the knowledge of what they are hiding. Chapter 24. The Murders in the Cathedral. On the evening of December 29th, 1170, 4 knights entered Canterbury Cathedral and murdered the Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Becket, at the altar. The murder itself is not a mystery. It is one of the most documented acts of violence in medieval history. The knights were identified. Their actions were witnessed by monks who wrote detailed accounts of what happened. Becket died with his brains on the cathedral floor, struck by 4 sword blows, the last of which was administered with such force that the tip of the sword broke off on the stone. But the questions surrounding the murder are not as simple as the act itself. The central question is the oldest and most debated. Did King Henry II order the murder? Henry's famous outburst, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" or words to that effect, is the most famous quotation connected to the case, and it is the primary evidence for his culpability. But the quotation itself is not entirely reliable. It comes from sources written years after the event, and the exact words vary between accounts. More importantly, even if Henry said something close to this, the question is whether he meant it as an instruction or as an expression of frustrated anger that his knights catastrophically misinterpreted. Henry claimed immediately and loudly that he had not intended Becket's death. He performed public penance, allowing himself to be flogged by monks at Canterbury in a dramatic act of contrition that served both genuine spiritual purpose and obvious political need. He was absolved. Was he guilty? The legal and historical debate has continued for 850 years. What is less often discussed is what happened after the murder. Within months of Becket's death, miracles were reported at his tomb. People who touched his blood or cloth that had been pressed against the wound reported healing. The blind were said to see. The lame were said to walk. Within 3 years, he was canonized as a saint, one of the fastest canonizations in the history of the medieval church. Canterbury became the most important pilgrimage site in England and one of the most important in Europe. The shrine of St. Thomas was encrusted with gold and jewels donated by grateful pilgrims. Kings came, popes came. Chaucer's pilgrims were riding to Canterbury at the end of the 14th century, 200 years after the murder, in a tradition that showed no sign of weakening. The shrine was destroyed in 1538 by Henry VIII as part of the dissolution of the monasteries. The bones of Thomas Becket were scattered. The jewels and gold were taken to the royal treasury. What happened to the bones specifically, whether they were burned, as official accounts suggest, or preserved by sympathizers, is not entirely certain. There is a tradition in Portugal that Becket's skull was taken there before 1538 and is still venerated in a church in Lisbon. The skull in Lisbon has not been definitively identified as Becket's. It has not been definitively ruled out either. Canterbury Cathedral has a memorial where the shrine stood, an empty space on the stone floor with a candle burning. The question of what Henry II said and what he meant by it, and whether it matters in the theological economy of a murder that produced a saint, this is a question that the medieval world understood in terms we have largely lost. Whether intentional or not, the killing of Thomas Becket produced something that outlasted both the killer and the killed by centuries. And what that means about intention and consequence and the way power moves through the world. The cathedral is quiet on the matter. It holds its memorial candle, and it does not say. Chapter 25. The Last Words of the medieval world. The medieval world did not end on a single day. It frayed. It unraveled gradually in different places at different speeds, with the New World pushing in at the edges, the printing press arriving in 1440 and beginning the slow democratization of knowledge, the Portuguese rounding Africa and finding the sea route to Asia and breaking the Venetian monopoly on eastern trade, Columbus sailing west in 1492 and finding a continent that no European cosmology had prepared anyone for, the Ottoman Turks taking Constantinople in 1453 and ending the last remnant of the Roman Empire in the East. But the medieval world's last words, the last things said and done and buried in the traditions that characterized it, are scattered across the 15th century in fragments that are individually small and collectively haunting. A monk in a German scriptorium, copying a manuscript in 1447, adds a note in the margin: "The new books are printed things without soul." He does not know that within a generation the art he is practicing will be economically obsolete. A family in a village near Siena buries a reliquary in 1480, in a place whose location is noted in a document that was subsequently lost. The reliquary has not been found. It may be in the ground under a field in Tuscany, or it may have been found long ago and its contents dispersed without record. A physician in Paris writes in 1488 a treatise on the sweating sickness that draws on his own experience of the 1485 outbreak. The treatise describes symptoms and treatments. It does not explain the disease. He knows he does not understand it. He writes this admission into the text. A merchant in Bruges in 1492, the same year Columbus sails, writes a letter to a correspondent in Antwerp about a shipment of cloth that has gone missing. He is worried. His business is not doing well. The Italian merchants are undercutting him. He doesn't know what he's going to do. The letter is found 500 years later in a bundle of old papers in a house in Ghent. An ordinary man, worried about his business, writing to a friend. 1492. The medieval world ending around him, unbeknownst to him. The letter says nothing about the end of an era. It says something about cloth. It is one of the most human documents in the archive, precisely because it is so completely unaware of where it stands in history. We are all always unaware of where we stand in history. The medieval people who buried their relics and sealed their rooms and maintained their rituals and kept their codes did not know they were living at the end of something. They thought they were living in the middle. They thought their world would continue. Most of them had no way of knowing how much of what they did and knew and believed would simply stop being transmitted, would be lost not in a catastrophe, but in the slow attrition of changing interest and changing institutions and changing language. The monk copying manuscripts in 1447 did not know his craft would be obsolete in 30 years. The family who buried the reliquary did not know they would lose the paper with its location. The physician did not know that the sweating sickness he was trying to describe would never appear again, and that his treatise would become one of the only records of something that medical science would spend 5 centuries failing to identify. They were just living, as we are just living, as the people who come after us will be just living, in a world that we, too, are ending without knowing it. The medieval world ends, officially, in 1492, or 1453, or 1485, depending on which historian you are reading, and which event they have decided is the decisive break. But mystery does not end with a period. Mystery simply accumulates. It sediments, layer upon layer, in the archives and the ruins, and the earthworks, and the graveyards, waiting for someone to look carefully enough. We have looked carefully tonight. We have traveled through 1100 years of a world that kept its secrets with extraordinary diligence. We began with the Voynich manuscript 600 pages of vellum that have defeated every attempt at translation, every algorithm, every expert, every obsessive, for more than a century. We do not know what it says. We do not know who wrote it or why. We know only that it is there, and that it has internal structure, and that the structure means something or means nothing, and that we cannot tell which. We move through the dancing plague of Strasbourg, where 400 people danced for weeks in the streets against their will and then stopped, and left behind an event that medicine has explained in general terms and not explained at all in the specific. Why those 400 and not the other 15,000 in the city? Why the dancing specifically and not some other expression of crisis? The question echoes. We spent time with the princes in the tower, and with the particular quality of their silence, not the silence of resolved mystery, but the silence of complete erasure, of a record that was closed before it was finished, by someone powerful enough to close it and keep it closed for 5.5 centuries. We sat with the Knights Templar, with their sudden arrest on a Friday morning in October, with their trials and their confessions, and their treasure that was not found, and with the Chinon parchment that sat misfiled in the Vatican for 700 years. We thought about the 85 kilometers of shelving in the Vatican archive and about what else might be waiting in the wrong box. We followed the sweating sickness through its 5 appearances and its final disappearance, and we acknowledged that we do not know what it was. We cannot know. The pathogen, if there was a single pathogen, is gone. It took its secret with it when it stopped appearing after 1551. We listened to Joan of Arc's answers in the trial that killed her, and we could not answer the question at the center of it. What were those voices? We had no better answer than the theologians who questioned her for 5 months in 1430 and 1431. The voices were what she said they were, or they were something else. Both possibilities remain. We found the princes in their tower, and we found Richard III in his car park, and we saw that 5 centuries of burial is not always enough to prevent discovery, and that sometimes the ground gives up what was hidden in it. We visited the lost villages of England, the earthwork ridges and foundation outlines, and the slightly different growth of grass over stone, and we thought about what it means for a community, an entire settled human community with its church and its street plan and its particular way of doing things, to simply cease, to become grass. We sat with the bones of Warren Percy and with the specific fear that caused someone to take a knife to a body in the graveyard, in the dark, to cut and rearrange and prevent what they believed the dead might do if left intact. That fear, the fear of the dead returning, is one of the most persistent human fears across all of history. The medieval world had it acutely. It had rituals to address it. It had theology to explain it. It had the knife when theology was not enough. We are not so different in the depths of the night, when the thoughts are loose and the dark is full. But tonight the dark is not threatening. Tonight the dark is old and quiet and full of things that have been sitting in it for a very long time without causing harm. The Voynich manuscript has been in libraries and archives for 600 years. It has not hurt anyone. It has simply sat and been looked at and resisted understanding and sat some more. The lost villages have been under their grass for 500 years. The earthworks that remain are gentle and low. The mist that lies in them in the early morning is just mist. The Templars' secrets, whatever they were, have been kept for 700 years. Whatever they knew or did or concealed has been in the dark for 7 centuries, and the world has continued. The darkness of the medieval world is not a danger. It is a depth. It is the depth that belongs to very old things, to things that have been here long enough that the question of whether they are threatening has been answered by the simple passage of time. They are not. They are simply old. They are simply there. They are the sediment of 1,000 years of human life, pressed down into the earth and the archive and the vellum page. Let your breathing slow now. Let the old dark settle around you. The Voynich text runs on across its pages. The lost villages lie under their grass. The Vatican archive sits in its controlled humidity, its 85 kilometers of shelving holding whatever it holds. Richard III is in his cathedral with his ceremony. The bones of Huaram Percy are in the ground. Joan of Arc is a saint, and the dancing has long since stopped in Strasbourg. The medieval world is not gone. It is in the ground and in the archive and in the walls of the cathedrals that are still standing. It is in the earthwork ridges and the sealed rooms and the misfiled documents. It is patient. It has always been patient. It will be here, unchanged, when you wake. But for now, for these few hours, let it rest. Let the old things rest. Let the darkness have its silence, and let yourself go gently into it, into the dark that has been here longer than any of the mysteries, into the quiet that was here before the medieval world began and will be here long after its last question is answered. Breathe. The night is very still. The mysteries are very old, and you are held very gently in the middle of all of it. Good night.